So, Jinni, Karli, and Kristen, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Michael, for having us.
So first, how's everyone doing?
Well, a little stressed with online college, but, in the same boat as everyone else, so.
Yeah, so are you totally online then?
Yeah, everything for me is online. So all my lectures, labs, recitations, office hours. I don't know, when the plan is to be back on campus, so.
Yeah. And Kristen, how about you?
Yeah, everything's online for me except for my clinicals. Thank God we get to go in person for that, so it's nice.
And you're going for nursing, am I right, Kristen?
Yes.
Yeah, my daughter's looking at nursing programs right now. She's really,
Cool.
yeah, she's a senior, so yeah. And Mrs. Forcucci, how are you?
I'm well. I'm adjusting into my new role. Looking through the lens of a mom as my two sons navigate a hybrid. So that's been interesting. So lots of change, right? Like, I think we're just in a space of constant adaptation, like just constant flux and change.
So I think your new role at the Delaware Department of Education is probably a good place to start this conversation. Why don't you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing right now, and then I'm gonna link into the chapter.
Yeah. So I could take the whole 45 minutes talking about this, but I won't. It is awesome. I'll just sort of say that first, the only way I would ever leave the classroom is to get into a space where I could make systems level change through an equity lens. And I am really, 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 really grateful that I'm working with a team and a work group. It's through Career Technical Education. So I'm working in the CTE team, specifically with teacher academies. And I'm also working with culinary and hospitalities. I'm going to be doing a lot of middle school work. It's all under the umbrella of equity. And my work group is an incredibly supportive group of people, like-minded in this goal. And so I'm working a lot with Ed Prep. So I'm working with the University of Delaware, Del State, Wilmington University. I'm working with our teacher academies and, making sure that our pipeline in Delaware is diversified. And so I should say this, I was very clear when I took the job that if I didn't get to be with kids, it would be harder for me and I wouldn't be a pleasure to work with. So I'm actually working with young people who are part of an organization, part of a program called Teen Sharp. And it's mostly kids from upstate Delaware. And they're just extraordinary young people who typically have their brilliance hasn't always been recognized by the schools that serve them. And so Teen Sharp does recognize the brilliance, offers supports if needed, and gets kids into spaces that typically they wouldn't have gotten into from the schools that they were attending. So they work with Teen Sharp. So they're just these remarkable kids, and we are co-writing a social justice curriculum together. So I'm with them on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and they revise and refine, offer texts, we vet texts, like talk about assessments. And so that's the part of my week that, Michael, like kids give me spark and life and breath. And so I have those conversations with them and then go back into the department, and those voices, those student voices that are in my head on Tuesday and Thursday afternoon follow me Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And so they push me to do the right thing and to center the student and families and communities.
Well, it's like you teed me up for the transition here, because for those of you that are watching and don't know, Jinni was instrumental in putting together this book, not just the chapter that she did with Kristen and Karli, but also coming up with the ideas behind the book and the premise and the outline. She was right there from the beginning, and no one was more of a champion for student voice than Jinni was. And you can hear that in her talking about her role at the Department of Education. And so I want to talk to her two students who wrote with her. I want to talk to Karli and Kristen here for a second. And before we dive into what you wrote, tell me about being in Mrs. Forcucci's class and what you learned about the things that you wrote about from being in her classroom.
It was just an awesome experience. I still think about it like all the time, even though I went more of a like sciencey route with like nursing and everything, but advocating for yourself and people. You have to be aware of like their cultures and their backgrounds, and you need to examine yourself and what you know first in order to do that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And like, I'm also a biology major. So, like, I guess sometimes, like, in college now, I don't have as much time. I'm not in as many English classes, stuff like that. But definitely, just like in everything I do and everything I write, like, I've learned to be a lot more introspective. And every time, there's like any kind of system, any kind of anything, I have to think about it in like, is this benefiting me because, there's like a system of oppression behind it that is, hurting someone else. Like, I've come to realize that, very little is coincidence, and it all sort of like builds off of itself. So like, I can't just be like accepting of the status quo. Like, I have to, at the very least, be questioning it, and then, going if I need to, see that I can try and change it.
I was going to make a comment that, like, as a science teacher, I'm thrilled that both of you went into science, science majors in college. But I think the statement that very little is coincidence is probably the most powerful statement in what you said there. And so, rather than joking around, I think we should probably get serious about that, because that's incredibly not just powerful, but also kind of lays the groundwork for what you wrote about in the chapter. And so, Jinni, you were adamant that so for those of you that don't know much about Flip the System or the book that we put together, what we're really advocating for is an education system that is driven by the collective expertise of teachers, and the reason for and a flattened hierarchy that is supportive rather than coercive, that is inclusive, that makes sure that all voices are being valued and included and are driving decisions in the system. But of course, we can't ignore that there are systems of oppression that are embedded in our education system as well as our other systems. But Jinni, as part of that, you were right there from the beginning saying, if teachers are going to drive those education conversations, if we're going to have the collective expertise of teachers driving, we need to make the case in the book that teachers need to be listening to students. And so I want you to just describe your thought process there. And you wrote about this a little in the chapter, but talk about why it's so important that teachers flip the systems in their own classrooms to be able to get the voice of students and understand their experiences in order for us to create the kind of education system that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's
It's
you
a lot.
asked
I'm
these
sorry.
questions. I know. Oh my gosh. So first and foremost, I think it's important to identify my own perspective, and both Karli and Kristen mentioned this. Like, self-identity and self-awareness is vital for educators, right? So when I walk into a classroom, I am hyper aware of what I represent. So I represent the majority of educators in the nation, right? 86% of educators are white women. And I taught at a school where the statistic was higher than that. And so kids could, and this would be an interesting question for Karli and Kristen, but kids came into my room often having never had a teacher that didn't look like me. So I had to be aware of that, but I wasn't aware of that at the beginning, Michael. Like, I didn't really know. I just loved kids and literature and thought it would all come together, because why wouldn't it? And then I recognized that not only was I not representative of the demographic in my classroom, but neither was my curriculum. And kids didn't say to me, Mrs. Forcucci, I don't see myself in the literature you're choosing. Writing assignments don't reflect the community where I live. Like, why aren't we doing research that impacts me? How come I don't see myself in any of the examples that you're offering in class, or in illusions? So they didn't come out and say that. But when you start to sort of read the room and you recognize who's participating and who's not, and you start to see that, like, there are trends, the silence becomes the tell, right? Like, they didn't have to speak up. My kids didn't have to speak up. I started to see sort of just I started to recognize that I was hurting kids, that I was supporting the status quo, that I was part of the supremacist culture, that as an individualistically driven human, supremacist ideologies were coming out in the way that I was engaging. And so I had to recognize that. And kids were full of grace. and eventually having these conversations with me when I started asking the right questions. And so when I started asking the right questions and I started changing up the curriculum and I started not just having the conversations one-on-one with young people, but as a collective, in our Socratic seminars and in my social justice class, when we started having those discussions, other young people in the room who have benefited from white privilege started to recognize the same things I was recognizing. And all of a sudden this like reciprocity thing started happening, right? So like everybody who came into the room knew that they were going to learn something from each other that day that was going to promote this collective liberation that our nation vitally needs to think about and support. So yeah, kids have taught me to be a better human, right? They've taught me to be a better mom and a better partner and a better friend. And if I hadn't listened really, really sincerely and then reflected on either the silence or sometimes their criticisms that were really hurtful sometimes, but like I needed to hear them because they were real.
You write such a powerful statement in your chapter that I think is important for teachers to hear, because I think for a lot of teachers listening to what you just said and starting to reflect for the first time on their own implicit bias and their own privilege, get defensive. Of course, right? Yeah. Because you say, oh, I'm doing these terrible things to kids. No, I would never do that, right? Like I'm not that kind of person, right? But you write in there, you say that you recognize that your love for students wasn't closing the gaps that you saw in your school. And it wasn't because you didn't have the best of intentions. You loved your students, but what you were doing wasn't working for all of your children. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's powerful to frame it that way. But Kristen, I want to go to you for a second, because Mrs. Forcucci just described her journey. But I think what you wrote in the chapter is incredibly revealing and also incredibly vulnerable. So thank you, just as someone who got to read it already. Thank you for that. But you talk about this from the other side, about being in classes where the teacher wasn't reflective in the same way, and having experiences where you didn't feel seen, and that some of your peers didn't feel seen in those classes. Do you want to share a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, I can. No, I didn't really experience the feeling like you were in on like the allusions and the references and you were in the text, like you just didn't feel represented. So it's easy to feel a disconnect. And I feel like a lot of teachers would interpret the disconnect sometimes as just behavioral issues from certain students, but it's just hard to be a part of something that it's like an inside joke that you're not a part of. And you just feel like you're always on the outside. But once you feel like your voice is uplifted, it's like a beautiful feeling. And it didn't happen overnight. I had Miss Forcucci for half of like my high school career, and it didn't happen overnight. Just being able to like trust your voice, kind of, it's a process, and she helped like upbuild that in everyone, and not just in these type of students or these type of students. It was really just you are all students, and we're all going to learn as one, and we have differences, but we're going to learn about them and share about them so we know how to approach things in the future.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me, I just went and reread your chapter again for like the 87th time before this interview to make sure that I was well prepared. But one thing that I wrote down that really struck me is that you described the feeling of feeling miserable, right? And that's such a powerful word. And then right after that, you talk about how students like you, African-American students in school, often feel like they only have two paths in school. Either they need to fight to be seen, or they need to be held back by the system. And there's no in between. And I think that's something that's incredibly difficult for those of us that come from a more privileged background to understand, because we never experienced that. And Karli, that's kind of the point of what you wrote, right? So why don't you share your perspective on the conversation we're having right now?
So I guess like my perspective really comes from like totally the opposite end, that like even from a young age, I have felt like I understand what's going on, that like references and allusions and like there were texts I was familiar with, and like even though of course there was times and like maybe it took a little extra effort to understand, I never felt excluded from the conversation or from the dialogue. And really I for a long time just like attributed that to myself. I was like, I'm a hard worker, I really enjoy school, like it was always a fun experience for me. And it wasn't until hearing about, the total opposite perspective that I realized like, all these great things that were happening to me. You know, they weren't things that I was just like earning of my own accord. It wasn't anything, you know, really that I was doing. It was this entire system put in place that's, you know, benefiting me at the, you know, expense of like so many other people. And, you know, it's definitely like, it was a very tricky thing for me to navigate, because, you know, immediately I'm like, you know, my privilege is like actively hurting other people, like in this minute, like, and my success, you know, I can't just like attribute it to myself. But when I think about it, and I'm like, the discomfort I feel in having those conversations is like nothing to the discomfort, you know, Kristen felt in the school system for like, you know, the entire time she's been in it. So, you know, it's just a lot of like self-reflection and, you know, always trying to be better, because I think that's the only way like you can, you know, work through it and move forward.
Yeah, it strikes me in your chapter you write about, I'm going to paraphrase because I don't have the exact words, but you mentioned hard work in when you were just talking there, and it brought me back to something you wrote about where you talked about how recognizing that you've had certain privileges doesn't mean that you didn't work hard in school. And I think, you know, anyone reading your chapter and seeing how successful you've been, and you know, just some of the things you wrote make it very clear that you busted your hump in school to, you know, to make sure that you were succeeding. And I think for a high school senior to have the wherewithal to be able to recognize your privilege at the same time as understanding that, like, you know, you've been doing this incredible hard work at the same time, I think shows a lot about you as a person. But also I think it was the way that you illustrated that in your part of the chapter was really powerful. Kristen, I want to go back, and you wrote about in your section a diversity project and how you kind of got excited about that at one point, thinking that it might be a break, or it might be the first time that you were being seen in the curriculum, and then your disappointment when it didn't continue. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So our diversity project, it was in like 6th grade. It was for a history class, and we were just looking at different cultural backgrounds. And at first, when the teacher explained it, it sounded like we were going to look at cultural backgrounds from like the modern perspective and people in our neighborhoods and the different ways that we all celebrate and approach life. But the way it actually turned out was it was more in a historical perspective. So we were learning about like the ancient ways cultures did things, and it was nice to still learn, but still at the end of the day, we didn't really learn much about each other in the classroom, and it didn't really provide as much of an opportunity to be seen as we thought it was. And we still enjoyed it and kind of interpreted it as like a stepping stone, like, oh, we're going to do more of these, and we never actually ended up doing them. And we all enjoyed learning about each other. It was actually a really fun project, and it would have been nice to like keep expanding on that over time, but we never got that opportunity. And it just felt like a start when like you take one step forward and then you take 2 steps backwards type of thing.
It strikes me as I'm listening to you talk about this, that you know, connecting back to what Jinni, what you were saying before, right, about the importance of student voice and being able to really understand your students. That too often when we try to do this kind of work as teachers, we don't go all the way, and we kind of take these half measures to try and include diversity in our curriculum, but we do it in a way that is so impersonal that we never get to the lived experiences of our students, and we're not able to change. Do you want to? I see you nodding. Go ahead. Dive in on that. Go ahead.
I talk about listening sometimes, and I'm like, oh gosh, I need like the zipper to keep, because I really want to talk sometimes. Yes, and this also, I want to address something you brought up a minute ago, and these things to go together, like the defensiveness that you mentioned, right? When teachers are told, like, you might have good intentions, Mrs. Forcucci, but your impact is injurious, and I don't feel good. And you used language that was marginalizing, or you used language that, you know, like, I lost sleep over last night, like whatever the call out is, that defensiveness is an opportunity to like just grow as a result of it, right? Like hear it and grow, and then like change it. So I have been defensive. I have gotten frustrated before. And then I've had to say, why? And so one of the things that I did that you just named is I taught a unit on the Harlem Renaissance, and I love Zora Neale Hurston. And I thought, I mean, I did not learn about the Harlem Renaissance in undergrad. So it was something I was really proud of. I created the unit. I was taking, sociolinguistics and learning from a Black professor about code switching, and, just my eyes were opening. I was starting to look through a different lens. I was really growing. And I look back now, and I feel like I should go back and apologize to the young people who learned that lesson from me, because to Kristen's point, I didn't tie the systems that we were learning about in the 20s to now.
Mm-hmm.
It almost felt like, oh, that's done. That's over.
Check the box. Yeah.
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 And I know that the kids enjoyed it. I definitely got writing assignments that were improved, and kids were reading and excited. And then fast forward, a decade or so, maybe longer. And we read The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. And the connection was so undeniably visceral in students, because it is now.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the celebration, like Kristen was saying, it was the celebration of community and culture now. And it was a look at systems now. And it was naming them in intensive ways. And we were having to bring in history to understand now. Instead of studying history sort of like in this isolated space, we connected it all. We connected the dots, and I think it was transformative. It was transformative for me. And there were kids who were like, what do you mean we can't read the next chapter? What do you mean we can't? And to Kristen's point also, it was everybody. Like this like what we're talking about isn't just for Black and brown children. Like I need that to be really, really clear. And it unified kids. It unified kids because vulnerability was embraced and truth-telling went down. And Karli's point, like when Karli, like some of my white students who've never left white dinner tables and have only prayed in white churches and have, never been proximate to anything except like whiteness, heard about a different America, and then allowed us to live in a space together saying, what can we do to change this?
Mm. Yeah. Karli, I'm going to come to you in a second, and I'm going to ask you about that experience. But I want to share that as I'm listening to this conversation, and as I reread your chapter today with a different lens, because I was preparing for an interview rather than editing it, it made me reflect on reasons why I appreciate this work and appreciate this chapter, and I'm committed to doing this kind of work. And for me, I think it ties directly to travel and being in spaces where I've been, I haven't been represented in the spaces where I've been in different countries, in, not being able to speak the same language. And I wonder, I guess what I'm trying to say is through those experiences, I became comfortable with being uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And I started seeing that discomfort as a way to identify places where I wanted to grow and get better. Right. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about in the classroom. Go ahead, Jinni, before I go to Karli, jump in quick.
Did you also, so just as a really brief story, but it's Dr. Chris Emdin, if anybody listening hasn't read Dr. Emdin, you really, really, really should. But Dr. Chris Emdin was speaking, and I was in a room similar to a situation you just described. I was the minority. And Dr. Emdin started dropping references and allusions, and everybody was laughing. Mm-hmm. And they were mostly like 90s hip hop allusions, and everybody was laughing. And I looked around, and Dr. Emdin is brilliant and amazing. And I'm in a professional setting. I'm with colleagues from the department and other spaces, other schools. And I did not want to insult Dr. Emdin because he's amazing. So I didn't want to not laugh and him be like, she's not enjoying this, like, which I'm sure he totally didn't care. But I felt like I had to like, laugh. And then I saw my colleagues. I didn't want them to think I didn't get it because I didn't want to look stupid. Mm-hmm. And then I immediately went to that space of how many times have I made kids feel like that in my room? How many times did kids laugh at a joke they didn't get because like it didn't include their experiences, or it was so like just it. how many times did they go along with what I was saying because they loved me, but got left behind?
Mhm.
And it really forced me to think about that. And so that's the lens, right? Like that's that culturally responsive lens that we should be rooted in as we design our curriculum, as we look at policies, as we look at procedures, as we look at everything that has to do with education.
So Karli, I want to go back to that space where you're in Mrs. Forcucci's classroom and you're reading The Hate You Give, or doing that kind of work and having those difficult conversations. And you write in your section of the chapter the importance of not walking away from difficult conversations. And you write it much more eloquently than I just put it, but I'm paraphrasing. And I want you to talk about your journey to get to that space, from a space of defensiveness to a space where you are committed to having these difficult conversations, even when they're extremely uncomfortable.
I would definitely say, I think honestly, my journey began with reading. I've always been like a really avid reader, and at least for me, it's always been a way to like gain empathy, because like when you're in a book, you're in like a character's perspective. It can like illustrate, a different point of view or a life that's like totally different than anything you've experienced or places you've been, or interactions that you've had. So I feel like reading in general really just sort of opened my mind, because that's sort of being able to, you can like never fully put yourself in someone's shoes, but if you can just like listen to what they're telling you about like their lived experience and just like have trust in what they've actually gone through, I think it can just like provide a perspective that's so different than your own. And I think as far as being defensive, it's definitely, there were parts where I was like really defensive and I was like, I don't understand this. And I think that's where the defensiveness comes from. Like the first time, I heard, white privilege, I was definitely like, well, I'm well off, and, my family's been really supportive of me and they care for me, and like school's going well, but like, how does that relate to me being white? And even like in having conversations with my family, there's still times they're like, oh, well, we're hardworking, stuff like that. But I think the more like research I did on my own to understand it is when, I was able to sort of get rid of that defensiveness, because I realized, white privilege doesn't mean you're not hardworking. White privilege, doesn't mean that you don't care about other people. It's just like, by being white, you're not going to, experience these hardships that like other people are experiencing. So I think for me, just like taking initiative, I could almost go through that defensiveness on my own, like in the privacy of like my own house. I could reflect on it and be like, and why do I feel this way? Because, people aren't like telling you these things just to hurt you. It hurts because it's like something that's been happening, and like that it's not okay and you have to change it going forward. So I think by reading and then doing my own research, I was at least able to gain like a foundation for further understanding. So when I went into the conversation, I could say, this is what I understand of it right now, and like I still totally don't know what it means in its entirety, but like I think we're coming at it from like a common place of like wanting to understand and move forward and be better.
I think you just described really well the reason why teaching empathy and humanity in schools is so important to a cohesive democracy. Right? Like, I know that wasn't your intention right there, but I think you just articulated that extremely well. We're almost out of time, but I want to, Kristen, I want to throw it back to you, and I want to get your perspective on those conversations in the classroom, to hear what it was like for you.
Well, there are always moments where it was uncomfortable, and I feel like it's important to know that it's uncomfortable for like everyone, where it's kind of like it's a privilege that Karli will never have her skin color be like the basis of a conversation or like for debate in class. Like it's uncomfortable that like your race is something that's debated, like something that you can't control, that you were born with, that millions of other people were born with. But it's important that it's had, because those experiences allow for so much empathy and understanding and allow for so many connections in the classroom. I remember one day, one student in our class, we were doing some projects for our senior project, and she said that she was addressing about Black people, and she was like, oh, African Americans. And then she asked me like directly about how do I feel about the term. And I was like, I'm not from Africa, so personally, I don't identify as African American. Like, I'm Black American. I don't know anything about Africa. Like, I'm only know it's a continent. Like I don't know anything that goes on there. And like those moments would be uncomfortable in any other environment, but it's the fact that we built that rapport and it didn't feel like she was attacking me or singling me out. It just felt like she was genuinely trying to understand something, and we all learned something from that moment.
Yeah, it's powerful. So before we go, I would like, I'm going to go to Mrs. Forcucci first, to give Karli and Kristen a little time to think about this. Okay. But if each of you could give just one piece of advice to teachers who are watching on how they could make their classroom more inclusive and more culturally responsive, what would it be? So Jinni, what would your advice be to for a teacher that's watching and wants to start doing this kind of work?
I think what Karli just described, listening, sitting in discomfort, reflecting on your own, doing it in a safe space. What I would add to that is that I've had thought partners along the way. I am, white voices should not be centered in this work. I'm very careful to be hyper aware of that. So when writing a social justice curriculum, that's why students are leading it, right? There are certain pieces that if I decide to read, I talk to equity leaders, Black and Brown colleagues, and say, is this appropriate for a white woman to teach? Would you join us? Would you teach it? Should we have a panel discussion instead? Like, we need to have relationships, and to Kristen's point, rooted in authenticity, not just let's do this for equity. Like, I have an authentic relationship with my colleagues, authentic relationships. And it's the call out to call in, right? Like, they call me out when I misstep, so that I can be called in and not do it again. So authentic relationships, constant reflection. There's no end stop. I will continue to grow. But first and foremost, like, I just need to give credit to Karli and Kristen. Like, these two remarkable young people are just, such an integral part of the journey and have helped me be a better educator. And that is invaluable. Like, I don't even know how to repay them for that. So when educators listen and grow as a result of youth, like, it's the right thing. And it's not even work anymore. It's personal growth. And again, liberation. Like, it's liberation. So listen and grow. Listen, grow, build community, and then go back and do it all over again, over again, over again, over again.
Kristen, what would you say?
I would say just to make sure that you elevate your student voices and take the feedback as you go. That just because you have a plan doesn't mean that you have to follow set through that plan from the start to the finish. And also keep in mind that it's hard for students to sometimes feel that trust after a long time of a system telling you that you don't have a voice or that this is the way things are supposed to go. It's hard for you to go up against an authority figure and be like, hey, that's kind of offensive or that's not really accurate. So just understand that it takes time on both ends and that it's uncomfortable, but from the discomfort, we can grow a lot if we work together.
All right, Karli?
I guess for me, one of the biggest things would be having really strong interpersonal relationships with your students, because when I think about classes across all subjects and the teachers that have the biggest impacts on me, I might not remember exactly the text we read or the essay I wrote, but I remember impact the teacher had on my well-being and my feelings of self-confidence, and my voice is valued in this space. And I think also just sort of Miss Forcucci was saying, being self-critical and willing to not be defensive when it comes to that. And I think about what Miss Forcucci wrote about love isn't always enough. But I think when you come from a place of love and then you're willing to be self-critical and willing to grow, and I think that can really extend across all things, when we're willing to be critical of things happening in our communities and then willing to change them so our communities can become better. When we're willing to be critical of things happening in our nations, it doesn't mean that we don't love our nation. We're critical because we do love it, because we want it to be better, because we think our votes do matter and we should be at the polls and we should be talking to each other and figuring out what's not working and why and how we move forward. So I think it's just the self-reflection and growth that results from that. And when you're coming from like a place of like genuine love and trust, then I think it makes you like willing to, you know, accept those reflections and be able to grow from it.
Wow. The three of you are incredible. I got to say, Jinni, to answer your question, I don't know how you can repay Karli and Kristen, but I will say that elevating their voices and the three of you putting together a chapter that is going to impact teachers all over the country and all over the world, and make them reflect on their practice and become better teachers. I think that's a pretty good place to start. I think that's awesome, and I know that there's excitement over this book, and I know that your chapter is going to be incredibly well received and is going to drive some conversations that need to happen. So thank you so much for taking some time today, and also for the great work that you did in putting the chapter together, and Jinni for helping me put this book together from the beginning. I am incredibly grateful to all three of you.
Thank you, Michael. You're awesome. You're so awesome. And I can't wait for like everyone to read this. I can't wait.
Me too. I can't wait for those of you that haven't seen the other chapters yet to get to read each other's chapters. Yeah, I'm 2 weeks, a little over 2 weeks, almost. We're almost there.
And I like your shirt.
Thank you. Yeah, we got that.
My whole family ordered them.
Awesome. I love it. Yeah. So for those of you that are joining late, we are talking about Flip the System US, how teachers can transform education and save democracy. You can buy the shirt and the book at flipthesystem.us. We'll see you all soon.